Good morning, everyone. Bore da, Croeso. Delighted to be with you here this morning. Before I start, I just wanted to apologise that I'm afraid I can't stay for the whole of the event as I've some other commitments, but I really did want to be with you at the start of today just to say a few words. Delighted to see such a great audience today. We have delegates from across a number of different sectors, testament to the changing way in which we're thinking about and delivering public services here in Wales. You don't need me to remind you that public services in Wales are under intense pressure. After a long period of austerity, the economic and social impact of the pandemic, the coming years will offer little respite for already stretched finances. And many of the challenges that we face in Wales today, inequality, public health, the climate emergency, are complex and interconnected. We have seen a global pandemic that has exacerbated already pre-existing inequalities. There's growing evidence that COVID had worse health impacts on people from minority ethnic backgrounds. Women were harder hit than men, and the pandemic has left a legacy of higher levels of disability in our communities. And it's also exacerbated socio-economic inequalities. And that's important because there is a link between those with protected characteristics and economic inequality. So we know the pandemic also had a bigger economic impact on people from ethnic minorities. Many people with disabilities have faced challenges in the workplace as they shielded, and some of course still are. And as we all face a cost of living crisis and a forecast recession, we know that these economic downturns often impact many groups with protected characteristics the hardest. So tackling inequality is a complex and difficult issue, but it's not one that the public sector can shy away from. The Welsh Government has set a national goal of a more equal Wales. And so the challenge is how to turn that into reality in these difficult times. So turning to the focus of our event today, equality impact assessments are an important part of the toolkit that we have for achieving that more equal Wales. They can help put tackling inequality and promoting equality at the heart of decision making. But as we say in our Audit Wales report, that's not where many bodies are at. In too many cases, it is still a tick box exercise that is focused offensively on avoiding negative impacts. So there is a missed opportunity to be using them as a strategic tool to help ensure that decisions and service changes are actively making a positive difference to promoting equality. Inequality is complex and it's affected by many other areas. So it's important that we view it not as a standalone issue. And increasingly we see public bodies in Wales moving to a more integrated approach of assessing impact, bringing together equality with other legal duties and policy priorities, such as the Welsh language and socio-economic impact. That's beneficial, it's great, but the challenge is still not to lose focus or to downgrade equality as just another box to tick. And as well as being a complex subject, we know that people are complex. Some individuals have many protected characteristics, and we know that public bodies need to get better at recognizing the intersection of those characteristics. And of course, people are also affected by multiple decisions. So while one decision may have limited impact in isolation, taken together with others, the cumulative impact on groups can really add up. So we need to see change in the way that equality impact assessments are made and are used. And that's not simply a technical task. It needs culture change and leadership. Public service leaders in Wales have an important role to play, not just in using equality impact assessments within the decision process, but in shifting the mindset and culture within their organizations. My report on equality impact assessments made 4 recommendations, all of which I'm delighted to say are being taken forward by the Welsh Government as they review equality duties. And today provides an opportunity to build on the areas for improvement that we identified in our report, to discuss ideas for improvement, to share examples of good practice, innovation, creativity that may be applied more broadly. My report included a recommendation for all public bodies to review their approach to EIAs in the light of the findings of the report and other sources of good practice. And so I hope that today's event will feed into that process for you and your organisations. I hope that everybody will take away some learning about things that they could do differently or better. And while in some cases we may be focusing on the technical aspects of an impact assessment, it's important to keep in mind that bigger picture and how we move together towards a stronger culture of embedding equality into all of the decisions that we make. Briefly, before I finish, I just wanted to say a word or two about the Audit Wales Good Practice team. Some of you may have attended some of these events in the past, but if you're new to us, welcome. The Audit Wales Good Practice team has a simple philosophy, which is that we don't believe in reinventing the wheel, we don't advocate a one-size-fits-all approach, and we believe in adapting, not adopting approaches. So the aim of all of these seminars is to encourage you to learn from one another, as well as from the speakers that we arrange. I see our role at Audit Wales as to make you aware of these examples and to provide you with the necessary details following the seminar. And I hope that you will see this as an opportunity to listen, to share, and continue those conversations. Do please see this event as part of a wider effort, not just a one-off for today. And please help us to extend the reach of this learning by sharing widely with your colleagues. We've got a fabulous agenda today, and my many thanks to all of those who are sharing their thoughts and experiences and expertise and giving of their time so freely. Finally, your feedback from our events today is important, not only on how today went, but also in shaping our future events. So if you've any suggestions for other topics, please let us know. Please get in touch with a member of the team, as there are a number of ways that these can be taken forward. The seminar is about making sure we're involving as many people as possible in the conversation and helping you to share your knowledge. So I'd like to encourage you to continue those conversations that you start today. We use an approach called randomized coffee trials that we've used for a number of years now with some fantastic outcomes. And I know Beth will explain a little more about that later. Enough from me. You want to get on with the day. I'm sure, I hope it will prove fruitful for you. And I very much hope that you enjoy the event. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Adrian. So I'm sure you don't all want to listen to me speak. So we'll jump straight into our first plenary speaker, Dr. Alison Parken of Cardiff University, who's going to talk about the place of equality impact assessments in advancing equality. So over to you, Alison.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm hoping you can see the screen and I'm hoping you can hear me. That sounds good. Yeah, thanks very much to the Wales Audit Office for asking me to come along and share my experience today on trying to enable public services to promote equality through policy making. Easy to say, but been working on it for about 20 years now. I think we're getting closer. So I just want to share some of the experience of doing that. And just to start, okay, here we go. So the intention behind today is to first of all review why we're doing this. We've got a long history of trying to promote equality in Wales, going back to the devolution settlement. So a little bit about how we've got where we are at the moment. And then also to talk about how to embed equality impact assessments in the kind of wider wraparound policy development model, so that EIAs are not quite so exposed. We have reached the stage, I think, where the equality impact assessment retrospective though it has become, is almost standing entirely for the operation of the public sector equality duty. And as the Audit Office notes, they're being used in a defensive manner, compliance-led, rather than, the intention behind the public sector equality duty, which comes out of the approach to equality known as mainstreaming equality, which is to promote equality in all that you do. So just going to talk about that for about 5 minutes. And then I'm going to talk you through the most recent use of the mainstreaming equality model, which was to look at the skills that are needed for net zero as we transition in Wales, and also to think about integrating the promotion of equality in the equality duties with the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. Particularly, the model, I think, gives a framework for the operation of those 5 ways of working. So we've just done this recent test with the Welsh Government, and I'll talk you through some of those collaborative and evidence gathering processes and solution finding as a way of demonstrating where EIAs can perhaps sit better in the process in terms of promoting equality. So you'll all be familiar with this. On the left side, the approach to equality known as equal treatment. We treat everyone the same, but we have unfair outcomes. The approach on the right is now often described as the equity approach, which is about giving people what they actually need in society and in the economy to participate. Now, I think that the idea of mainstreaming equality is that you would be removing that fence, or at least making it a transparent chain link fence. So mainstreaming comes out of the idea that you are not just looking at vertical equality policies, you're looking across everything the organisation does, the way it does business, the way it provides services, the policies it produces to do those things. And you're looking at the way inequalities are embedded in systems, structures, and functions. So mainstream equality, coming out of the approach of gender mainstreaming, is about ways of seeing and doing. So questioning all those underlying assumptions and digging out the drivers of inequality, and ensuring that you aren't making things worse, but with the intention of absolutely using every policy opportunity to promote equality. And therefore, it's a much more systematized and structural approach to addressing inequalities, and preventative and thinking about the long term. So what we're trying to do with mainstreaming is stop reproducing existing inequalities each time we produce new policies. And we've got a long history of this in Wales. And the model that I'm going to talk to you about today has been used. It has been developed into an equality mainstreaming model from original gender mainstreaming roots to encompass all the strands of inequality, and also to think about how we can develop intersectional evidence, as well as using equalities evidence to activate human rights. And that work was done in Wales in 2007. And since the model has been used, in part to develop some of the specific equality duties, the collaborative approach to that. During the WAVE project, the Women Adding Value to the Economy project on addressing gender pay gaps, and more recently around diversity in public appointments, the foundation economy, and then this most recent use was in trying to describe what skills we might need for net zero, but using the mainstreaming approach, we have problematized that question, if you like. Each economic transition doesn't necessarily address existing inequalities. It can, in fact, exacerbate them. And we know that from our history in Wales in the transition out of coal, and now we're looking at decarbonising again, but we're also looking at new industries, new occupations and sectors. How are we going to ensure that there is full diversity and inclusion, and we take these opportunities to promote equality as we move into the net zero era? So this is the model. And what you will see immediately is that at stage 4 of the model, we're looking at the impact assessment. And so the assessment of the proposed solutions comes after we've spent considerable time thinking about the policy problem and reframing it, gathering the evidence that we need to understand inequalities in a whole policy field, bringing in equalities evidence from experts by experience, thinking together about policy solutions, and then testing them to make sure that we haven't inadvertently missed somebody out or could potentially be making things worse. So we are starting here from the premise that whatever the business goal we are trying to achieve, we're going to get there by promoting equality. So the EIA is not policy, let's check no one is harmed by this policy and potentially make mitigation. The EIA comes after a whole process of thinking about how we would embed the promotion of equality in the particular policy we're thinking about. So that's putting it right at the front. And therefore, that's why I'm saying EIAs at the moment are a little bit lonely if they come towards the end of the process and they're only compliance focused. Why not have a system where the whole purpose is to promote equality, and then you just check that you haven't potentially left somebody out or made things slightly worse. The model operates, and I'll come back to that diagram as we go through the evidence gathering on net zero. The model operates by forming an equalities evidence panel made up of policy officials whose knowledge we need because we've got to translate our evidence of inequality and ideas into the policy frame. Academics who can bring a wider set of contextualized knowledges based on evidence to the problem. So it's particularly useful if you're looking at a kind of policy field where you want to understand the inequalities across different equality strands and how they may intersect and compound each other. And also experts by experience. And in some cases, that's equality organisations working together. And in other cases, that's also bringing in people who've actually had experience of the policy service, whatever it is that we're focusing on. So that's three sets of knowledges coming together to understand the evidence and create solutions. So just going back to net zero. Okay, so the case studying we're talking about is the transition to net zero. So working with the Welsh Government, thinking about the skills that are needed for our transition to net zero in Wales, and picking up the Climate Change Committee's focus particularly on those decarbonising industries, at least to begin with. And so we formulated an evidence panel. We asked people, would they give us their time and help us out with this project? And we put together an evidence panel that included, as you can see, most of the equality organisations that have a kind of all Wales remit, the Office of the Future Generations Commissioner, several of the policy think tanks in Wales, the Wales TUC, and crucially Sustain Wales, who are working very hard on policy around climate change. And then we included a number of academics who've been working on the greening of steel and also the transfer to digitisation, because the net zero change is not the only pretty dramatic change that's going on in the labour market at the moment. And then on the supply side, these weren't members of the panel, but we invited them to come in and give us evidence. Careers Wales, Gwyliau Cymru, regional skills partnerships. What are you doing in preparation for the transition to net zero in terms of training and skills, changes to occupations, and how are you considering equality in that change? All right, so having done a fairly quick literature review and identified the inequalities in this policy field, we can very quickly see that those sectors that are decarbonising, the energy sector, construction, changes in engineering, etc., are very male dominated, with a kind of older white working class workforce, and that there aren't simply enough of them, if you like, to go round in terms of the kind of numbers that we will need. So CITB says we're going to need another 12,000 plumbers. Construction sector says we need 25,000 more construction workers. The National Grid estimates, another 26,000 working in energy by sort of 2035. where are we going to get these people, and how do we make this an opportunity to break down some of those occupational segregation barriers and bring in people, women, people from ethnic minorities, disabled people, and particularly younger people, into sectors that they have not really considered as being for them. There are chill factors about working in these sectors. So we then started to consider, are we thinking about this too narrowly, really? Pretty much all jobs will change to some extent in the transition to net zero. We will be looking at, in the health service, at new products and processes. The example is, turning over to kind of aerosols from the kind of gas pumps and things. There'll be new materials being used. The way I teach in higher education will change. What I teach will change. The way that the legal profession works, the architects, building surveyors, road transport, the transport industry more generally, most of our jobs will to some extent need to change if we're going to hit these net zero targets. So we pretty upfront said you shouldn't just be focusing on the decarbonising industries for a just transition. So we gathered together the evidence of the skills that's needed. We did some deliberation on what is a green job, and we expanded that out. And then we started to think, how do we include everybody in this process? And then at that point, the Equalities Evidence Panel became really very useful and very helpful, because, they were then able, those equality organisations, to give, their understanding, their research of existing barriers in education and training and employment for the people that they were advocating for. And together with the knowledge that Sustain Wales had, we began to build this kind of slightly different understanding of a just transition. And then we got the supply side in the colleges and the Careers Wales and things. And it became very apparent that there was a kind of demand issue here. They were ready to go, businesses were ready to go, but the wider policy environment wasn't very enabling at that point. What are we aiming for? Will it be electric? Will it be hydrogen? We need that stronger policy direction. It also, from those supply side organisations who've been thinking about net zero skills and equality, became very apparent that they were aware that diversity was an absolute key to finding the right people and getting people into skills and getting existing people retrained. We want to avoid the position where jobs change and people lose their jobs and you just make new hires. We want that retraining and reskilling to happen too. And the supply side, colleges and people saying, we've got a real problem here in the labour market with inequalities and diversity, lack of diversity. And we're going to need everybody to be involved in this transition. We might have an issue here. If you want to meet these targets by 2030 and 2050, we might be able to do that. We might be able to skill enough people. We might bring people over borders in order to do that. But I'm not sure that we can address equality in that same timescale. So again, you've got this kind of business case versus equality issue. But on the corollary of that is that without addressing equality, without diversifying this potential workforce of the future and also retraining the existing workforce, we possibly can't meet those net zero targets. If you want to meet the targets, you need to address the inequalities. So it's this sense of always using the equalities and understanding existing inequalities and where you want to go, and get there by promoting equality is what you want to do. So the next stage was visioning, and we came up with a number of policy proposals for the Welsh Government, way outside how many skills are we going to need in construction and what can we do to apprenticeships to make them feel a little bit more amenable to various different groups of people. And that included, taking ownership here of fair work as far as the Welsh Government can in terms of recruitment and training, in terms of renewables and retrofit. And, mass carbon literacy programme for everyone in Wales, so that everybody can learn at home, take that learning at home into work, learn at work, take that learning back to their communities and make changes as well. Unless we really work very hard, this climate change net zero stuff is going to feel a lot like it's not for me, to many, many people. And we already know from other research that the effects of climate change will impact on those people in the lowest socioeconomic groups much more than other groups. Okay, so having done the visioning and putting the proposals together, we then set out what an EIA might look like. And very much, so our question, so going through the mainstreaming process, and I'm kind of aware I'm not explaining this quite as well as I should. Going through that mainstreaming process enabled us to completely redefine the question. We're not just looking for skills for net zero, hard enough though that is, hard enough to define what they are, hard enough to ensure that the skills system is fit for purpose. What we're saying is that the transition to net zero is a real opportunity to address labour market inequalities, but these economic transitions don't do that in themselves. In fact, what they tend to do is exacerbate and entrench inequalities. So our question is, how do we ensure that we don't carry existing inequalities through into the transition to net zero and actually promote equality? But an understanding too, from the evidence gathering and also in the solutions proposed, that the existing labour market inequalities will make this transition much harder. It complicates things and it creates new challenges that you cannot overcome simply by putting on some courses in some colleges and saying that we welcome everyone. It's a much deeper transition than that. And as I've described, it may mean making sure those fair work principles are owned by the government, if you like, in terms of some direct employment around renewables and retrofit. And you will have seen most recently that the government is thinking about having its own renewables company, and we can't take credit for that. I think it's an idea that's been around. But what we're saying is, if you want that transition to work, you want to keep the value in Wales, then you have to ensure that that workforce is put together in a way that promotes equality and increases diversity and inclusion. That's the way to get to net zero. We then talked to the panel about, right, what's the best way to assess impact? We've come up with these fantastic ideas, quite radical, possibly well beyond what the Welsh Government was anticipating. And other ideas in the solutions also included a well-supported and resourced workforce transformation programme in terms of changing the culture of inequalities in the organisations that are providing the training, as well as any new organisations and existing businesses. So understanding that the way the labour market inequalities work at the moment, it really puts people off from going to work in certain sectors and certain occupations. It has effect on recruitment and retention. We must recognise we have an inequalities issue across workplaces in Wales and really do something to intervene in that. And also job redesign, a job redesign service, so that we're not losing people as skills requirements change and employees are involved in redesigning the job roles and training that they need. So the panel then put their mind to, well, how do we, we've had these great ideas, we may not have thought of everything. How do we make sure that we assess the potential impact? And in a sense, this is going back to what Adrian was saying very clearly. We are assessing the ability of the policy to promote equality. Will this take us where we want to go? Will we get the diverse workforce that we need to meet our net zero skills requirements? It's not just checking for negative impact. It has to be about how effective might this be in avoiding the reproduction of inequalities as we move into the net zero era. And I think the key here from the discussions we had with the evidence panel is that what we tend to do is produce a policy and then produce a consultation document with a very narrow set of questions, based on the business goals. And then there may be some further equality questions in there too. But that framing often closes down the potential for people to give their lived experience of trying to apply to a college, attending a college, the financial barriers, the travel barriers, the stories we've heard from young women about becoming electrical apprenticeships in West Wales, and finding their toilet was a mile away. We need those stories as part of this evidence gathering. Will what we're proposing work, or are there still things on the ground that will need to change in order for these highfalutin policies to work? How do we improve the policy? And I think, we've had a kind of decade of moving to hard data and quantitative work. And my appeal here is that this has to be a qualitative engagement. You have to be speaking to people and be engaged around the solutions, as well as the opportunity to test the politically intersectional solutions. So, for example, when we did this model on unpaid carers, from the perspective of disability, from women, from older people, and from younger people, flexible working was their number one requirement around managing unpaid care and work or education. And that's a politically intersectional solution because it manages to help people across different protected characteristics. So that's my plea. It's about engagement in terms of testing these solutions. So what we have found, and particularly when we used this model a couple of years ago with the Future Generations Commissioner's Office around testing future climate policies and how they may increase inequalities, is that the elements of the model are bring together the 5 ways of working quite neatly. I'm not saying this model is perfect. It needs adapting to different situations. But it's a collaborative model. It has involvement at its heart and throughout. And what it tends to do is to produce long-term and preventative solutions that by their very nature are integrative across the policy areas. So we started out looking at skills, and we ended up with recommendations around mass carbon literacy programs, changes in education, the investments of the Development Bank of Wales, government ownership of various parts of the net zero project, economic development, employment, etc. So that's why mainstreaming is tough. It's not about telling everybody about it. It's really about understanding the drivers of inequality and ensuring that we don't reproduce them in the policies that we're making, and that we take those policies as an opportunity to promote equality and use that EIA in a very positive way. And I apologise, it was a massive project, and I've tried to do justice to it in about 30 minutes, and I hope that that's useful and that you have some questions. Thanks, Sam. You can stop sharing now.
Thank you, Alison. Have you got any questions? I can't see that any of them come in. Well, they go. Emma, do you want to unmute yourself and ask?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Alison. That was excellent. And my cogs are turning, so I'll try to articulate my question, but it's not fully formed in my own head yet.
Go for it.
In the Audit Wales report about equality impact assessments being more than a tick box exercise, they were talking about the propensity we have to equality impact assess large things when often smaller operational service changes tend not to be impact assessed. And I really like the way what you were describing is where it's about mainstreaming this way of thinking, this way of challenging what we're doing and looking at evidence and qualitative evidence all the way through. And I wondered if you had any lessons learned or advice for us on trying to change the culture in our organisation so that we implement what you've suggested from your net carbon zero example, maybe for some of those smaller operational changes that they may happen without even having a quality impact assessment done. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I mean, it does. And I think the Audit Wales report also talk about the HRC's guidance around proportionality, and suggest that the Welsh Government, when we do the specific equality duties review, set out what they mean by that. And they also, as you say, quite rightly note that, you know, some of the bigger stuff gets done and some of the minor stuff doesn't. This model, you know, is quite an investment in time and working together. So the panel met, I think, about 8 or 9 times over about 6 months. Net zero is a rather large, as I said, all-encompassing set of questions. And I think what we've learned from doing the retest is that you might use this whole process for some of the really big decisions, the budget, the strategic direction in various policy fields, and that you would then hope that some of that would then trickle down when there are individual policies being changed. In a sense, you've already got an evidence base, you've already got a direction of travel that intends to promote equality, and that you would then have somewhere to go and revisit the evidence and the policy direction when you're making those smaller operational choices. That's a guess. The other thing is that, you know, to do this properly, you need to resource it, and you need to help organisations have the capacity to engage with you. So you might be doing, right, we're changing the strategic direction of X or Y, or we really want to do something in health about, you know, the inequalities around that Black and minority Asian women suffer around maternity. So we're going to take that as a big project, and we're going to look at that. And we're going to gather an evidence panel. We're going to work with them in a focused way over a few months. And then something comes up that's kind of related a few months later. Well, you can then lift the phone, can't you? You can lift the phone and have that conversation. You've got the framework, you've got the collaborators, you may have helped them with the capacity to engage, but you can then do what they want. You know, these quality organisations want to be involved in policy influencing, but you'll have made those connections. You could then potentially be having conversations with people, couldn't you? This is what we did in our bigger project. This is the direction we're taking. This has come up. Do you think this is a significant change? Should I be doing an EIA or not? Even though it looks to me like a smaller policy, I'm concerned about X and Y. I don't know if that's a real answer. It's a difficult organisational situatedness kind of contextual type thing, isn't it? But I'm thinking if you do this on the bigger decisions, you've set out how you're going to promote equality. Some of the smaller decisions should be more obvious.
Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Alison. Has anybody else got any more questions? Oh, Suzanne?
Yeah, hi Alison, thanks very much. That's really interesting. Just coming in really on the back of what Emma said, and I think in a way, on a practical level, I feel it's almost harder to do the big picture stuff in this way than the smaller, you know, the individual policies, the operational decisions, etc. So, for example, you know, when we're setting our very, very high level wellbeing objectives for our council plan, you know, that's very high level. For each of those objectives is going to be a whole body of work that's going to be going on to try and achieve that kind of outcome that we want to get, whether it's, you know, better health and well-being or better transport links or whatever. And I think, you know, obviously we have to do that work at that very high level. But what we find ourselves kind of saying they tend to be quite superficial in a way. And what we end up saying is, you know, there's potential here to affect these particular characteristics in terms of improving accessible transport, for example, or whatever. But the individual pieces of work that will go on to work in that area, we will be doing the detailed policy development and assessment work at that level at that time. And I think it's easier to kind of to have that focus and have those discussions on when there's specific things that we're trying to do, and indeed the more operational decisions, like, you know, if you're going to change your bin rounds, you know, what might, how might we use that, etc. So I find it harder to actually have a meaningful EIA approach at a very high level, strategic level, without just making very kind of bland statements really about overall positive intent. Do you see what I mean?
I do, but I think what we're kind of trying to do is go back to that first set of principles. You know, the public sector equality duty says advance the quality of opportunity. The mainstreaming duty in the Government of Wales Act says promote equality of opportunity for all people. Mainstreaming is understood as attempting to change the systems and structures, the things that keep reproducing inequality. So at that very high level, you've got to go back to brass tacks. What is it about my transport system that creates inequality? And to do that, I think what I'm saying in this model is that you do that through that mix of academic evidence and an evidence panel of people working through whatever the substantive issue is with you, bringing their experience, their own research, and of course their ability to go back and talk to the people that they represent, and to bring forward people with experience to talk to you about what it is about the transport system that's creating inequality. And it is at that point that you understand the drivers, and therefore you start to produce some of these smaller policies, isn't it? You start to lay out, okay, well, if I'm going to change that bigger picture, then here are a number of things I need to do, if you like. And so you are already collecting your evidence about what you need to do. You're starting in a different place. And then when you bring those 10 policies to life, you know, you already know what the inequalities are and what you intend to do and how you intend to use them to promote equality. And then you are doing that smaller piece of work subsequently on potential micro impacts. Do you see what I'm saying? So that's why it's not easy. That's why it requires this upfront thinking and investment of time and evidence gathering and evidence sharing and collaboration when you're doing the higher picture stuff. And the other thing I would say is that, of course, quality organisations are experts in what they do. They're not experts in every policy field, and particularly in net zero, we were all a bit like, well, what's this then? You know, we're not climate experts, and you know, I don't really know quite how a plumber's job is going to change. We have to learn on the job, and again, that collaborative work, and particularly having the sustainability organisations in there, enabled us all to learn and to see these connections between net zero, well-being, equality, you know, involving citizens, etc. So I think what you're saying is that it can be easier at a micro level to see if the harm is going to be the outcome of a policy on a protected characteristic. And I think what I'm saying is, I think we need to move away from that. The opportunity to promote equality is in those higher level strategies, and you're setting out a way that you then follow that through when you get to your lower level policies to enact that bigger ambition.
Thank you. Yeah, that's it, as you say, it's a massive cultural change, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, as was demonstrated by the Audit Wales report, you know, the approach we take now is very different to that.
Yeah, and it's become entirely clear the last 2 to 3 years we've been working on this, the overlap between the mainstreaming model and the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act is enormous. So, you know, when we articulated this in 2007 as a way of trying to work out how we need to change tools based in gender mainstreaming so that they would work across the equality strands, could they work? How did they need to be adapted? How could we get intersectional evidence? That, you know, we were doing collaboration and involvement, and we were thinking about prevention, but we didn't name those things as those at that time. And we're just very fortunate now that we have this act that actually really codifies those ways of working. And the model brings together in a framework the ability for organisations to do that, rather than have EIAs over here and something else going on over there. And EIAs, as I said, unsupported, if you like, by the rest of the policy development process.